Welcome all to today's presentation on the novel The Invisible Man written by h.g.wells. It is part of the curriculum for 3rd BA English. I am Dr.R.Saritha, Assistant Professor of English, Sri Sharda College for Women, Autonomous. The Invisible Man belongs to the literary genre of fiction. Fiction is any type of narrative work which is completely imaginary. There are different types of fiction, such as novel, short story, and novella. It is a favored genre among the masses. Novel is one of the literary forms that developed in the 18th century in England. The word novel originally meant a little new thing. Let's see the author h.g. Wells. The author Herbert George Wells is an English writer. He was born on 1866 to poor parents in London. He loved reading and became a science teacher. He initially published science textbooks. Afterwards, he published his first science novel, The Time Machine, in 1895, which paved way for his popularity. H.G. Wells is regarded as the father of science fiction. Apart from being a writer, he is also a journalist, sociologist, and a historian. As the world wars were going on during his time, he advocated freedom and peace. He was the president of PREN International. He died in the year 1946. Now, let's see plot of the novella The Invisible Man. The novella Invisible Man was published in 1897. It is the story of Griffin, a scientist who turns himself invisible. In the beginning, the protagonist enters into an inn named Coaches and Horses, located in the Epping village situated in Sussex. The owners of the inn are Janie Hall and George Hall. They are referred as Mr. and Mrs. Hall in the novella. Mrs. Hall is happy for Griffin's stay because it is extremely cold during this month and none of the rooms are wanted for stay. Griffin's appearance is strange, but she accepts Griffin and allows him to stay in their inn. The protagonist goes to the room and tells her not to disturb him frequently. However, she comes to deliver food. It is a mustard pot she brings to her room. When Griffin sees Mrs. Hall, he hides his face. From the beginning chapter, we see a mysterious atmosphere and abnormality of the protagonist. Mrs. Hall thinks that the guest is covered throughout his body by bandage because he has met with an accident. As she talks with Griffin, he inquires whether his parcel will arrive to the inn. Mrs. Hall replies it will only on the next day he will receive the parcel. The protagonist is unhappy but accepts the reality. This shows that Griffin is really short tempered. Teddy Henfrey, the clock mender in Epping village, is called on by Mrs. Hall. He fixes the clock in the stranger's room. When he tries to strike a conversation, Griffin gets really angry and asks him to finish the work soon. Teddy Henfrey meets Mr. Hall outside the inn and tells him about the stranger Griffin. He tells this man is really weird. Mr. and Mrs. Hall have argument. However, Mrs. Hall wins the argument against her husband and lets Griffin to stay in their inn. In this chapter, we realize that Griffin is addressed as a stranger and throughout the novel by the Epping people. He is really unpredictable and highly temperamental. The next day, the stranger's luggage arrives. He went down to fetch them. However, a street dog bites him. Everybody feels bad for Griffin. He immediately goes upstairs to check. Mr. Hall, worried, follows Griffin and is shocked to see his harmless shirt. He does not utter anything about this particular incident. The boxes belonging to Griffin contain scientific instruments made of glasses. Griffin calls himself as an experimental investigator. Soon, the owners are hearing crashing sounds of the bottle, and there are also loud noises coming from Griffin's room. Mrs. Hall cannot keep his guest in proper manner. Word spread about stranger and his liking for physical and scientific experiments. Hence, a physician, Dr. Cuss, comes and meets Griffin. During their meeting, the armless hand of Griffin pinches the nose of the physician. Dr. Cuss is completely scared. We see that the violent temper of Griffin is growing day by day. He also likes to surprise others by showing his invisible hand. There is always a mysterious atmosphere surrounding Griffin, and things start changing in the Ipping village. The vicar of the village, Mr. Bunting, is robbed of his money. People of Ipping doubt only Griffin. Mrs. Hall has also not been paid bill by Griffin, so she is furious with the guest. A lot of queer things happen, and so Mr. and Mrs. Hall goes to Griffin's room but finds it empty. However, Griffin is inside the room but he is invisible. In anger, he moves all the furniture and clothes. Mr. and Mrs. Hall are completely shocked. This sight paralyzes them. We see that Griffin's thoughts and actions are morally degrading through chapters as they progress. He begins to terrorize other people. After witnessing such a shocking scene, Mrs. Hall thinks it is because of some ghost being possessed in the room. Epping people come and pacify Mrs. Hall. Jaffers, a sheriff, comes to arrest Griffin because he has stolen money from Bunting the vicar. When Jaffer tries to catch the protagonist, he quickly disrobes his clothes, becoming invisible. So, thus, all the people witness the invisibility of Griffin. Griffin successfully escapes. The news about this peculiar incident spreads throughout the village and other villages surrounding Ipping. Griffin never thinks about his action. He hurts others voluntarily and never regrets his action. Griffin goes around the village and finds a man named Thomas Marvel, who appears to be idiotic. He forces Marvel to become his helper. Griffin then goes to Coaches and Horses, where he fled earlier. He drags Marvel too. When he enters invisibly into his room, he finds the unpleasant sight of Mr. Bunting and Dr. Cuss. Seeing his journals, Griffin hurts both of them for prying into his business, and they flee by giving the journals to Thomas Marvel. Momentarily, Thomas Marvel escapes with Griffin's journal to Ports 2. When Marvel tries to converse with a random stranger and he tries to converse about Invisible Man, he is stopped by Griffin. At one point, Thomas Marvel escapes from his clutch and runs away to Port Burdock. Griffin chases him as the Invisible Man. He, in fear, enters Jolly Cricketer's pub and seeks help from a police who's present in the pub. Thomas locks himself in her prison to safeguard him. However, during the meantime, Griffin is shot by a stranger who's present in the pub. Griffin becomes uncontrollable and tries to dominate others excessively as the novel progresses. The wounded Griffin enters an unknown house in Port Burdock and finds it to be his senior Kemp's home. Kemp is a well known physician in Port Burdock. Griffin learned medicine initially at university and he was an albino also. Suddenly, he becomes interested in physics and studies optics in another college. He accidentally discovers about making things invisible. For time being, he likes to eat and sleep in the Kemp's home without being disturbed. He instructs Kemp that he should not inform his presence to the police. However, Kemp understands the gravity of the situation. He informs Colonel Ade to arrest him the next day. Griffin slowly explains his experiment to Dr. Kemp the next day. After finding about invisibility, he tested it on a fabric, which actually disappeared. Then he experimented on a cat, but the paws and eyes of the cat were still visible. He advanced the formula and he tried it on him. The owner of his flat becomes suspicious. Finally, Griffin becomes invisible when he tries it on himself. Before leaving the flat, he sets the building on fire. He mails all his scientific equipments and books to Portland Street. Dr. Kemp, after hearing the story, feels really uncomfortable about Griffin's action. However, Griffin justifies his theft and murder. He wants to terrorize England with his power. When Colonel Ade shows up, Griffin escapes. The entire truth behind all Griffin's action is given out by Dr. Kemp to the police. People of Port Burdock are warned about Invisible Man and they lock themselves up inside the room. No food access is given to Griffin. A letter warning Kemp arrives to his home. Griffin declares that he is going to murder Kemp on the same day. Through all these incidences, readers will realize that Griffin is mentally unstable and is not behaving like a human being at all. Kemp comes up with a plan and he locks himself inside his home. Colonel Ade is outside guarding his home along with other policemen. Windows start breaking upstairs in Kemp's home. This signals arrival of Griffin. Kemp gives his gun to Colonel Ade and Colonel Ade walks away from home. At this moment, Invisible Griffin gets hold of Colonel Ade. He attacks him and makes him unconscious. Griffin then breaks into Kemp's home. However, to his dismay, Kemp escapes from his own home. Dr. Kemp escapes into the town street and starts running. He screams that Invisible Man is following him. The town people hold Invisible Griffin and start beating him violently. This shows the braveness of all the people in the town and the trust they have on Dr. Kim. As Dr. Kim asks the people to stop, they all stop their action. Griffin has become breathless. He dies poorly after receiving strong beating from the people. His albino body becomes visible after death. The end of the novel shows that science should be used only for good and for creating advantageous things for human beings and not to terrorize people. In the prologue of the novel, we see that Thomas Marvel is having all the investigative journals of Griffin. However, Griffin is not alive to enjoy any kind of recognition and dies poorly at the hand of all the town people. The theme of the novel. H.G. Wells insists that humanity should be the foremost concern of any individual. The science should be used by the individual to serve for the benefit of the people instead of ruining the human lineage. Hence, the theme science versus humanity. The next theme is power versus morality. Through the next scene, we see that power should not be used without any conditions. It is dangerous. People should be morally correct and not abuse the power. So, these are the themes present in Invisible Man. This novel has been adapted in 1993 as a film. A BBC TV series was also published in the year 1984. It also came as comics by the Marvel. I like to conclude today's presentation. These are the references for H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man. Thank you.